She sang believing her mom could hear her. That's how the story was told for years. But it began on a quiet Sunday night, on a show where nothing ever broke the rhythm. Not for presidents, not for legends, not for anyone. Ed Sullivan was the man who never cracked, the face of perfect control. But on this night, a 17-year-old girl walked onto his stage holding a folded note, and everything changed. What started as another song on another broadcast became something else, a moment that stopped the cameras, froze the audience, and revealed a side of Ed Sullivan almost no one alive had ever seen. And the truth behind what he read and how he reacted is a story that still shakes people decades later. Because sometimes, in front of millions, a person doesn't perform. They simply break for all the right reasons. The winter air outside CBS Studio 50 carried its usual Sunday quiet, the kind New Yorkers recognized from decades of watching families rush home before Ed Sullivan came on. Inside, the building hummed with familiar routine. Stagehands checking cables, the orchestra tuning warm brass notes that drifted through the rafters, and the faint smell of sawdust from the sets being shifted into place. By 7:55 p.m., everything was exactly as America expected it to be. Millions of households from Ohio to Ontario settled into their living rooms, ready for the comfort of a show they trusted like family. Ed Sullivan stood backstage, straight-backed and steady, reviewing his cue cards the way he had for over 15 years. There was nothing dramatic about this particular broadcast, nothing unusual in the lineup. To the crew, it promised to be a regular night, a welcome return to calm after the whirlwind episodes of the early 1960s. The Beatles had come and gone. The circus acts, comedians, and Broadway numbers had restored the gentle, predictable rhythm of the show. And Ed, always conscious of timing and control, prepared to deliver yet another seamless performance. He greeted the acts with his typical reserved nods. A juggler from Chicago, a comedy duo from Boston, a pianist from New York, and finally a soft-spoken teenager from New Jersey named Linda Foster, who would be singing midway through the program. Nothing about her arrival suggested anything out of the ordinary. She shook Ed's hand politely, thanked the stage manager for guiding her backstage, and took her place in the wings with a quiet focus that the producers found refreshing. But one detail did not fit the routine. Just minutes before Linda was set to go on, a production assistant hurried across the stage, an envelope in hand. He approached Ed, and the moment he whispered who handed him the note, Ed's expression shifted. Not dramatically, not enough for the cameras to catch, but enough for the control room to notice he paused a few seconds longer than usual before stepping into the bright wash of stage lights. As he walked out to his mark, the audience applauded with its comforting Sunday warmth. Ed nodded, adjusted the cards in his hands, and began the broadcast with the same steadiness America knew so well. But behind that steadiness was a new weight, quiet, unseen, but unmistakably present. Something had entered the show tonight that was not part of the script. For the first 20 minutes, the show unfolded with the smooth confidence that had defined it for years. The comedians hit their marks, the orchestra swelled on cue, and Ed moved from act to act with his usual precision. Viewers at home saw nothing unusual. Yet inside Studio 50, a faint shift had taken place, subtle enough to be hidden from the broadcast, but powerful enough for those backstage to sense it immediately. Ed Sullivan was a man who lived by timing. In the booth, directors often joked that he kept time better than the orchestra's drummer. He never rushed, never lingered, never allowed a single second to slip from his grasp. But as he prepared to introduce his next performer, the envelope handed to him earlier remained tucked behind his cue cards. He touched it with his thumb more than once, as if the paper itself carried a kind of temperature change. Not hot, not cold, just human. When the previous act stepped off stage, Ed cleared his throat. Once, then again, slightly longer than usual. "Stand by, Linda," whispered the stage manager, gently guiding the young singer toward her mark in the wings. Linda Foster looked collected, but one detail betrayed her calm. She held a small, folded sheet of paper in both hands, gripping it with a nervous firmness. A few musicians in the pit exchanged glances when they saw it. It wasn't typical for a singer to walk on stage with something in hand. Props were planned, notes were rehearsed, but this was personal. The floor director raised his hand. 5 seconds to air. The cameras tilted into position. The applause sign warmed up, and Ed Sullivan stepped toward the lens, the envelope still tucked behind the card, now trembling ever so slightly in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but quieter than expected. "Our next guest is a very talented young lady from Trenton, New Jersey." He was supposed to read the prepared introduction after that. The orchestra waited for the cue. The cameras leaned in, but Ed didn't continue. Instead, he paused, glanced down at the envelope, then looked toward Linda standing just out of frame. She gave him a small, hopeful nod, a gesture so soft it might have dissolved into the lights if Ed hadn't been watching her closely. The control room tensed. The director leaned forward. "What's he doing?" someone whispered. Ed lifted the envelope and unfolded the handwritten page inside. It was not part of the show, not reviewed, not rehearsed, not approved by CBS. Yet in that moment, he made a decision almost unheard of for a man who ran his stage like a train schedule. He read it. The paper trembled slightly between Ed Sullivan's fingers, just enough for the studio lights to catch the movement. For a man known for keeping his hands perfectly still, the gesture spoke louder than words. He took a breath, glanced once toward the wings, then began reading in a tone that softened the entire room. "This is a note from our young singer, Miss Linda Foster." A murmur swept across the first rows of the audience. It wasn't curiosity so much as something quieter, an instinctive understanding that the next words would not be part of the usual Sunday comfort. Even the orchestra members lowered their instruments, sensing a disruption in the show's familiar rhythm. Ed continued, his voice measured and unusually gentle. "Linda has asked me to share this before she performs tonight." He swallowed, then lifted the letter closer to the light. "My mother is very ill. She has been in the hospital for several weeks." The room froze. Several audience members straightened up. A man in the balcony lowered his camera, choosing to listen instead of snap a souvenir. Linda kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her folded hands pressed to her chest. The letter was hers, written in haste, written in hope. For days she had rehearsed alone, believing her mother might be watching from a hospital bed in Trenton. But that morning, everything changed. Doctors had told her family that her mother had slipped into a deep, unresponsive state. Still breathing, still fighting, but silent. Ed resumed reading, now more slowly, as if each phrase carried a weight he felt responsible for honoring. "She told me, before I left for New York, that if I ever stood on Mr. Sullivan's stage, she would find a way to hear me, wherever she was." A hush fell over Studio 50, unlike anything ever captured by CBS microphones. You could almost hear the creaking of the old wooden stage. Even the cameras, usually buzzing faintly as they rotated, seemed to still themselves. Linda took one half step into the light, just enough for part of her face to show on camera too. Tears sat unfallen beneath her eyes, but she held steady. She had not come to the show for fame, nor to be discovered. She had come because it was the last promise she could honor. Ed reached the last line of the note. "So tonight, I sing for her, and I hope she hears me." He folded the letter with a care that surprised everyone, including himself. Then he looked at Linda, really looked, and nodded once, a silent blessing. The orchestra waited for a signal. The cameras waited for movement, and America waited for a song meant for one person. The conductor lifted his baton, but even he hesitated a half-second longer than usual, as if unsure whether music belonged in a moment this raw. When the first notes of "You'll Never Walk Alone" rose from the orchestra pit, a slow, trembling swell of strings, the entire studio felt smaller, almost chapel-like. Linda stepped into the full light, its warmth settling over her like a fragile shield. Her voice entered softly, barely above a whisper, shaped by days of worry and one morning of devastating news. But within seconds, something shifted. The tremble steadied. The tone broadened. She was singing not for the 300 people inside Studio 50, nor the millions watching at home. She was singing for a single hospital room in Trenton, for one woman who might never wake again, but who had made a promise only a mother could make. As Linda reached the first chorus, a cameraman later recalled that he felt a chill climb his arms. "I'd filmed opera stars, Broadway legends, but nothing like that," he said. "It was like the whole room leaned in to carry her." Ed Sullivan stood off to the side, a few steps beyond the camera's edge. His posture, usually rigid as a fence post, seemed to soften. His shoulders lowered. His eyes never left Linda's face. He was a man trained to maintain control, a man who once corrected performers for stepping a single inch off their mark. But control had slipped from the room. Something older, something fuller, now held it. Halfway through the performance, Linda's voice quivered. The line, walk on, caught in her throat. She inhaled sharply, as if gathering the courage to continue. The audience didn't move. No one coughed. No one shifted. No one whispered. It was a silence so complete that one lighting technician later admitted he forgot to breathe. Then she found the note again, stronger, clearer than before. When she reached with hope in your heart, a single tear slipped from her left eye. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't need to. The final chord lingered in the air far longer than the conductor intended, and when it faded, the room remained still. No applause, no rustle, no release, just a collective ache. Ed Sullivan stepped toward her slowly as though crossing sacred ground. His face, always firm, always guarded, carried something unfamiliar, full, unfiltered emotion. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The cameras captured the moment, but the expression was for her alone. "Your mother heard every word," he said. The audience rose in a wave of sound. Applause that wasn't applause, but gratitude. When the applause finally settled, slowly, like waves returning to shore, the studio returned to the controlled chaos of a live broadcast. But Ed Sullivan did not return to his usual rhythm. He tried. He straightened his cards, cleared his throat, attempted to bridge the moment with the next scheduled act. But the words on his cue sheet looked foreign now, almost trivial. A magic act from Boston, a comedy skit from the Midwest. None of it seemed to belong to the world the audience had just stepped into. For the first time in years, he let silence linger longer than the producers preferred. Viewers at home later said it felt like watching a great oak bend in the wind for the very first time, something unshakable revealing its hidden vulnerability. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a softness that startled even those who had worked with him for decades. "Sometimes," he said, "a show stops being a show." Inside the hospital in Trenton, nurses on the night shift passed a small television between them, whispering updates from the broadcast as they checked on patients. One nurse later wrote to CBS that when Linda hit the high notes of the final chorus, Margaret Foster's pulse briefly quickened. "It was faint," she wrote, "but real, like someone trying to turn toward a voice they know." The story swept across the country with the sunrise. By morning, CBS mailrooms were drowning in letters, thousands of envelopes marked with trembling handwriting, stamped from small towns and big cities alike. People shared memories of singing to their own parents or listening for a last message from someone they loved. Some wrote simply to say thank you. Others wrote because they had no one left to write to but Linda. Producers saved many of those letters. They sit today in private archives. Their ink faded, but their meaning intact. 3 days after the broadcast, Linda received a call from the hospital. Her mother had slipped away during the early hours of the morning, peacefully, quietly, with the same grace she had lived by. Among her belongings was a postcard she had written before her condition worsened, addressed to Linda but never mailed. It read, "Your voice is the part of me the world gets to keep." Linda would go on to study music, Ed Sullivan would mention her performance in an interview the following year, calling it a reminder of what matters most when the lights are brightest. The clip resurfaced decades later, rediscovered and shared online by people who hadn't even been born when it aired, but who felt its truth as if they had, because on that night, in the middle of a world built on timing and polish, a young woman sang not to be seen, but to keep a promise. And a man who never broke open on camera allowed himself just once to be fully human.